Starting off at number 30, the worst rare in the game is the Barbarian Hut. It just doesn't get a lot of value for 6 elixir. It's way too vulnerable to spells, and I feel like at this point we're just patiently waiting for it to get a buff or a rework like the Goblin Hut and the Furnace did. Next, we have the Battle Healer. At this point, even Elixir Golem decks commonly don't even use her anymore. You might occasionally see her inside of a Golem deck, but even in that, there's just going to be better options most of the time, and she's just very weak and doesn't get enough value in majority of situations. Next up, we got the Three Musketeers. At 9 elixir, they're just way too expensive in majority of situations to get as much value as you're looking for, and they're going to be very vulnerable to spells like the Fireball and the Poison, for example, and just in this meta, the more evolutions they add into the game and more cards, they just seem to get worse and worse, and they're just very difficult to use. The Elixir Collector is just very matchup dependent. If your opponent has a spell that counters it really easily, like the Earthquake, then it's going to be practically useless, but even if your opponent doesn't have a great spell against it, it can be very risky to use because your opponent could go all in when you go in for that Elixir Collector, and also a lot of the decks that have the Elixir Collector in it, like Three Musketeers, are very weak, so you pretty much can only run it inside of something like Golem, but most Golem decks are going to be better off not using the Elixir Collector. At number 26, we got the Elixir Golem. I would say he's just overall a pretty weak win condition in most scenarios. He's definitely going to be easy to pick up and play if you want to use him for fun, but most people that know what they're doing know how to counter him pretty easily, and it's a nice way to get an elixir advantage when you're playing against him, so he's just not going to be that great in a lot of circumstances, and he's a very risky card to play, without a doubt. Next, we have the Goblin Demolisher. Ever since they gave this card a really big nerf, it has been a lot worse ever since. They tried to give it a small buff to help revive him. Hasn't done very much. For the most part, you pretty much can only use him inside of Goblin Drill decks. That's going to be about it, but in most scenarios, you're going to be much better off running better support cards inside of your Goblin Drill deck, like the Bomber, for example, which serves a similar purpose for less elixir, making him not that great. The Heal Spirit is definitely the worst spirit in the game, and it's also the only one that's a rare as well. You pretty much can only use it inside of Bridge Spam decks, but a lot of Bridge Spam decks don't even run it, so I feel like it's pretty niche, because even Sparky, which isn't in the best spot nowadays, very rarely use something like the Heal Spirit in it, and the other spirits are just going to provide a lot more value, so that's why it's not going to be very high on this list. The Wizard, guys, has seen a tiny bit more usage recently, especially in the shift of the meta that we've seen. Ever since the Evolved Furnace has come out and the minions got buffed, he's been a bit better, which is why some people actually use him as the card or evolution of choice inside of things like Royal Giant or even Graveyard Freeze. Definitely still a below average rare, but that splash definitely does make him pretty useful in a lot of situations, and of course on mid-ladder, people are known for running him as well. The Zappies, guys, are pretty good on defense in a lot of scenarios, especially after they ended up getting that fire rate buff where they're shooting a little bit more frequently now, and you get that perma-stun effect almost more often because they're attacking more frequently. It's going to be pretty good against tanks, but with a lot of people running things like Fireball and Poison in the meta, they're definitely going to be pretty easy to break through in a lot of circumstances, and also you can't fit them in too many things. You're mostly only going to see them in Recruit decks as the main thing, and maybe an occasional Royal Giant deck, but there's just going to be better support cards than them the vast majority of the time. The Suspicious Bush is a very interesting win condition, I guess you could say. If your opponent doesn't have a small spell, it could get a lot of value, or if they don't have a building, but there's a lot of people running at least one small spell in their deck or a building, which makes it a very inconsistent win condition, but because it is only 2 elixir, it is pretty low risk whenever you play it, but it also is kind of hard to fit into your deck, which is why for the most part you're only seeing it in some off-meta log bait decks, maybe with things like the Dark Goblin or the Evolved Goblin Barrel, but you need to have another win condition with it because on its own, it's not going to be effective as the only win condition in most decks. At number 20, we got the Battle Ram, and it's honestly the same scenario as the Suspicious Bush. You can't really rely on it as your only way of getting your main source of damage on towers, because there's so many stuns in the game, like the Ewiz, for example, the Zappies or buildings, which are going to stop it right in its tracks so easily. So you're going to rely on other support cards to hopefully reach your opponent's tower, or something like maybe a Mega Knight or a P.E.K.K.A. Hopefully you're going to be able to get that to the tower, because the Battle Ram on its own isn't super consistent, which is why I do think it's a below average rare card overall. Next, we have the Goblin Cage. I think it's a bit worse compared to some other buildings because it's pretty inconsistent. It's practically useless against air decks because, well, the Brawler's only attacking ground cards, so if you're against something like a Balloon or a Lava Hound, it's not really having any additional effect. And also against cycle decks, it's not going to be very good. I think both the regular Cage as well as the Evolution are very matchup dependent, making it not a amazing card. But if you are against something like a Golem or an Electro Giant, for example, then it's going to be very useful. The Mega Minion is going to be okay inside of some things like maybe a Golem deck or a Giant deck, but there are going to be better support cards than the Mega Minion. For example, the Minions, for example, significantly better in the vast majority of decks. But if you do want a mini tank that isn't going to die to something like Arrows or a Fireball, it could be a good choice, but there's just going to be better options than it, so you have to use it in very specific decks, like something like Giant, for example. The Inferno Tower, kind of like the Goblin Cage, is going to be very matchup dependent. The difference, though, and what actually sets it apart from the Goblin Cage and makes it better, is it actually is going to be a very effective counter to certain air decks, like the Lava Hound and Balloon, for example. It's going to be a very solid tank killer, but it's still really going to struggle against cycle decks. And also at 5 Elixir, it's going to be a lot easier to outcycle compared to something like a Cannon or a Tesla, which is why you don't see it as much. And you got to worry about resets like the Lightning, for example, which are absolutely going to wreck it. So it's mostly only going to be great against tanks, and you pretty much can only run it inside of log bait decks as well. Next, we have the Flying Machine, which is going to be decent, especially for baiting out things like Fireball, which is why it's very effective inside of Royal Hogs recruits, because someone might Fireball the Flying Machine, and then you can, of course, go in for the Royal Hogs. It's also going to be pretty decent inside of Lava Hound decks as well. Lava Flying Machine is known for being a pretty good combination, but there's going to be better support cards than it. For example, the Minions, for example, or an Inferno Drag, you're commonly going to see inside of things like Lava Hound over the Flying Machine, because they just tend to get a bit more value in more circumstances, but it's an okay card. The Tombstone guys can actually get a good bit of value on defense for only 3 Elixir, but in my opinion, the biggest drawback of the card is it's just not really that versatile compared to buildings like the Cannon, which is the same Elixir cost, but you can simply run it in just about every cycle deck. Whereas the Tombstone, you pretty much can only run it inside of heavy decks. You're only going to be able to use this card inside of things like a Lava Hound, Graveyard, or maybe a off-meta Royal Giant deck. And a lot of those decks oftentimes don't even require the Tombstone, so it's not a requirement. It's more so the type of building you can use it if you want to, but in the right deck, and if you do want to play it, it definitely can be very good in certain matchups, especially if your opponent doesn't have a spell like an Earthquake. Next, guys, we got the Musketeer. Now, she's going to be a pretty decent support card, especially in the right decks. Inside of things like 2.6 in Loon Cycle especially, the Musketeer is going to be very good and get a lot of value, especially her evolution. The standard version, though, don't get me wrong, is still very valuable. In fact, decks like 2.6 prefer oftentimes running the regular Musketeer over the evolution if they want to run something like the Evo Cannon in the deck, or the Evo Skeletons, or the Evo Ice Spirit, for example. But there are going to be better ranged attackers you can often use instead of the Musketeer. For example, like the Evo Furnace, or even things like the Ice Wizard nowadays tend to get more value. So she's just kind of an average rare, I would say. At 13, guys, we have the Earthquake. In this current meta, there's not nearly as many people running Royal Hog Cycle with the Earthquake, which is why I'm not having it super high. But I do think it is very good, especially inside of Hog EQ. It is so solid, and you're almost constantly seeing it whenever you're facing a Hog deck with the Mighty Miner and the Firecracker, for example. It's going to be very good at allowing you to break through buildings like the Evo Cannon, which is so solid, or things like the Tombstone, or of course the Goblin Hut, which is also an incredible building in this meta. It's going to be very useless, though, against air decks or just flying things in general, which is definitely going to be what balances it out compared to other spells that are better than it. The Giant, guys, is a solid tank. I think, though, currently there's just tanks that are better than him currently, like the Golem, for example, and the Evo Gob Giant. But the Giant is going to be amazing still inside of things like Giant Graveyard, or there's some people that still really like to run the Giant Prince combination, which can be so obnoxious to stop sometimes. Buildings, though, are going to counter him very easily, and also some high DPS attacking cards like the Mini P.E.K.K.A. or the regular P.E.K.K.A., which is why I think he isn't too much higher on this list, but in certain combinations like with the Prince in the Graveyard, he can be absolutely OP, especially on offense. Next up, guys, we're going to have the Furnace. The regular Furnace, not even the Evolution, is a very solid card. The Evolution, I would actually make the argument, is still borderline broken even after the couple nerfs it got, but the regular Furnace, ever since they did that rework, it has been so much better ever since. The fact that it walks just adds way more utility to the card, allowing you to use it for your counter pushes, which can be absolutely amazing, especially when you're running something like a Golem deck or a Evo Gob Giant deck or even a Graveyard deck. You have that Furnace walking up, supporting your push, spawning those Fire Spirits pretty often, and it has a really long range too. Just definitely a very good card all around, but it definitely does have its counters like Poison, for example. In our top 10 now, we got the Royal Hogs. The Royal Hogs have always consistently been a pretty good win condition. Royal Hogs cycle, though, with the Archer Queen has kind of fallen out of the meta a little bit, which is why I don't have them higher than this. But inside this new Mighty Miner Evo Baby Drag deck, they're very good. And with the recruits as well, I just think they're such a good combination. There's, of course, going to be ways of stopping them. You got all the buildings nowadays, like the Evo Cannon, the Goblin Hut, and the Bomb Tower Fireball, which is why I think they're not too much higher, because they definitely do have their fair share of counters, but they're just definitely a consistent win condition no matter the meta, without a doubt. Next, guys, we're going to have the Bomb Tower. This is definitely a much better building compared to the Tombstone and the Inferno Tower, without a doubt. This building has a lot of splash, which I think makes it very useful in a lot of scenarios, especially if you're matching something just what I was talking about, say something like Royal Hogs or recruits. It can be really, really nice to have that splash in those types of matchups. And then even when you're against an air deck, when the bomb tower ends up breaking and you have that bomb, can be useful if you're playing against something like a balloon, which is why it's going to be very good inside of things like Loon Cycle or maybe a miner deck or a drill deck, for example. Not, of course, as good as something like the Evo Cannon, but definitely a lot better than the other rare buildings. At number 8, guys, we're going to have the Ice Golem. Ever since it got that really big health buff, we can't deny how much better it has been. You can even use it inside of things like Expo again, so people are running 2.9 Expo with the Ice Golem instead of the Knight. You can use that if you want to. There's some people using it now even more inside of Loon Cycle, and also 2.6 is actually in a pretty decent spot in this meta, which is hard to believe it's been out for so long. Just gets so much value kiting things, and it's a really solid tank, and it's just been even stronger than it was before it got that health buff, and I just think it's a solid rare card at the moment. The Valkyrie, guys, is a very solid card in this current meta. Of course, the Evolution, we all know how good the Evo Valkyrie is, but just the standard version is very good in this meta because there's a lot of people running things like Evo Witch because of the Vines. Graveyard's a very good win condition at the moment too, and there's so much baity cards too that the Valkyrie's just going to do such a good job against, and she's got a good amount of health too, and there's actually a lot of people using her, so much to the point currently there's actually more people running her than the Knight, which is kind of hard to believe, but mid-ladder players have been telling us all along how good she is, and at the moment, she is a very, very good rare card. The Rocket, guys, has been one of the better spells in the game for a very long time now. Even though they reduced the amount of damage it did to towers a while ago, it has not been too much worse since then. It's going to be very good, of course, inside of bait decks, goblin drill decks, Expo decks, and even minor rocket decks. Very good, especially in triple elixir when you're going for that rocket cycle for free damage on the tower. And then even defensively, it can be very good if you have to defend a very large push and just going for that rocket, able to wipe everything out in a lot of situations. A very, very good spell without a doubt. In our top 5 now, guys, we got the Dark Goblin. What's actually interesting, guys, is the regular Dark Goblin, in my opinion, is actually better than the Evo Dark Goblin. Ever since they nerfed the Evo Dark Gob, where the gas essentially doesn't last forever, people have now been using the regular version, which has just been a lot better. So then they use 2 other evolutions instead of the Dark Goblin in their Dark Gob deck. The Dark Goblin is going to be absolutely amazing inside of things like Bait, of course, with the Evolved Goblin Barrel. It's going to be very good in Mortar, and of course very good in Recruits, and probably a couple other things you want to use it in as well. If you don't have the right spell for it, it's going to get a lot of value. It moves very quick too, so it can just be really tricky to deal with if you don't have the reaction time and the right cycle. At number 4, guys, we got the Mini P.E.K.K.A. The Mini P.E.K.K.A, guys, without a doubt, is one of the best rare cards in the game, in my opinion, especially right now because we're in a beatdown meta, so it's pairing very well inside of things like Golem, Evolved Goblin Giant, and more, and it's also going to be able to counter those beatdown decks very well too, and they just buffed it so many times recently. Most recently it got a hit points buff, but then before that it got a damage buff, so all the buffs have really been piling up, and it's now a force to be reckoned with without a doubt, and I think it is just a very strong card, and I would say it's actually pretty underrated still at the moment too, even after the buffs it ended up getting. In our top 3 now, the best rare building without a doubt, guys, is definitely the Goblin Hut. Ever since they reworked the Goblin Hut, it has been so much better, and even though they gave it a nerf, it has still remained to be the best rare building in my opinion. It just pairs so well inside of Graveyard decks. Graveyard, one of the best win conditions in the game. You can also use it in some other things as well. Maybe you want to run it, for example, in something like Electro Giant or a Miner deck you could use it in. Maybe you could even fit it inside of a Hog deck if you want to. Spawning those Spear Goblins more frequently, it's just getting a lot more value, and also being 4 elixir instead of 5, it's just a safer option compared to what it was before. At number 2, guys, we have the Hog Rider. The Hog Rider is the best rare win condition in the game, in my opinion. No matter what the meta is, he is always viable. Of course, there's Classic 2.6, which seems to never die. There's Hog X NATO. There's Hog EQ. You could even maybe run Hog Freeze if you want to. Tons of off-meta Hog decks that you constantly see mid-ladder players running, and even some people push to the top of ladder with some unexpected Hog deck. He just gets a lot of value for only 4 elixir, and even if your opponent has a building, that's why you got those spells in your deck, like the Earthquake to get you through the building, or the Rocket, so you can go Rockets on the tower if you can't get the Hog to the tower, and no matter what the meta is, you can always have success with him. And at number 1, guys, the best rare card in the game, in my opinion right now, is the Fireball. Just like the Hog Rider, no matter what the meta is, there's always going to be a lot of people running the Fireball, and you can fit it in so many different decks. Of course, heavy decks like the Lava Hound oftentimes have the Fireball as one of their spells of choice. It's going to pair very well with an additional spell like a Zap maybe, or a Log. You can use the Fireball too in heavy decks like the Giant or the Royal Giant, and then it's also going to be very good inside of cycle decks with the Hog Rider, for example, the Goblin Drill, the Expo. If you need direct damage, which a lot of people do prefer having in a lot of decks over the poison, it's definitely going to be a good spell for you to use. That's going to be the list, guys. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe. You can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game, and let me know in the comments below what you guys agree and disagree with.